"Take your hand off him." The words cut through the dining room, quiet and absolute. A waiter had a homeless boy by the arm, halfway to the door, and the whole restaurant had turned to watch him be removed. The boy wasn't fighting. He was already apologizing, already shrinking, clutching a battered book to his chest like it was the last warm thing he owned. And the woman at the corner table, silver-haired, still terrifyingly calm, had risen from her seat. She would spend that entire dinner wondering why the boy's face unsettled her. She had, after all, buried him 14 years ago. To understand how a woman comes to bury a grandson who is still alive, you have to go back to a rainy season that ended a family, and forward to the night it began, impossibly to knit itself back together. Her name was Vivian Ashford, and in that city she was closer to a legend than a person. She owned hotels the way other people owned umbrellas, 3 along the avenue outside, a dozen more scattered across the coast, and the very building this restaurant paid rent to occupy. She had built all of it from a single boarding house and a stubbornness that frightened bankers. At 68, she had more money than she could spend in 3 lifetimes, and she ate dinner alone every Thursday at the same corner table at the same restaurant, because a house that size makes a poor companion, and because routine is what people cling to when they have run out of people. The boy was 18, though hunger made him look younger and the street made him look older, so he seemed to hover at no age at all. His name, the one the world had given him, was Eli. The one his mother had given him had been erased from every record that mattered. He had aged out of the foster system 8 months earlier. 1 birthday, 1 signature, and the last roof they were obligated to give him was gone. Since then, he had learned the geography of the avenue by heart. He knew which restaurants threw out untouched bread, which doormen looked away, which back alleys stayed dry. This one, the one with the gold letters, was the richest street in the district. Rich streets meant good garbage. That was the whole of his strategy the night he walked in. And it was not a coincidence that brought him to Vivian's table. It was arithmetic. He had watched her through the glass for 20 minutes. She had ordered the fish and the fresh bread and the chocolate dessert, and she had barely touched any of it. He had done the math a starving person does automatically. Half a fish, a full basket of bread, a plate of something rich left to go cold. So he came in. He apologized to the host, apologized to the air, and by the time he reached her table, he had apologized 4 more times. "Can I have your leftovers, ma'am? I haven't eaten in 3 days." The waiter reached him before Vivian could answer, and that the whole room turned, and that was the moment she stood. "This young man is my guest," she said, in a voice that did not rise. "Bring him a chair in a clean setting." The boy tried to refuse. People were staring, he said. He didn't matter. She had asked him who told him that, and he hadn't been able to answer, because the truth was that everyone had, for as long as he could remember, and he had come to believe them. At a nearby table, a woman in expensive jewelry set down her fork with a clatter loud enough to be a statement. 15 years she had eaten here, she announced to the waiter, and she did not pay what she paid to dine beside a vagrant. She demanded the boy be removed or she would leave and never return. Vivian turned to her without hurrying. "Isabel Ashford," she said, offering her own name like a receipt. "This building is mine. The 3 hotels on the avenue are mine. The lease this restaurant lives on is mine. And in all my years, I have learned to tell the difference between the poverty of the pocket and the poverty of the heart. That young man has more dignity in one hand than this room has in all its jewelry. If a hungry human being ruins your appetite, the door hasn't moved." The woman left. No one missed her, and the boy sat down at the finest table he had ever seen, in front of the best meal he had ever been offered. And for a moment, he forgot to be ashamed. What Vivian did not tell him, because she did not yet understand it herself, was why she had done it. She would tell herself later it was pity. It was not pity. It was the same nameless pull that had made her look at his face twice, then a 3rd time. A pull she had no word for and no reason to trust. the pull of a body recognizing what a mind had been told to forget. To understand that, you have to know about Maya. Vivian had one child, a daughter. Maya had come late and been loved fiercely, and in the way of fierce love administered by a proud woman, been loved wrongly. Vivian had wanted for her daughter everything she herself had clawed out of nothing. Security, standing, a name that opened doors. Maya had wanted to paint. She had wanted to fill notebooks with color and set them loose in the world. And when she was 23, she told her mother she was in love with a man who had no money and no prospects and no interest in acquiring either. Only a guitar and a gentleness that made Maya feel for the first time that she did not have to become something in order to be worth loving. Vivian had said terrible things. She had said them the way only a parent can, aiming for the softest place and hitting it. She had called Maya's life a waste. She had said no daughter of hers would throw away everything for a boy who painted clouds. And Maya had walked out, and the silence that followed had lasted years, until it was interrupted by a phone call from a hospital, and then by a funeral, and then by a second, smaller coffin that Vivian would carry in her mind for the rest of her life. Because Maya had a son, a boy of 4 with his mother's eyes. And when Maya died, a fever, an infection, the ordinary cruelty of a body giving out. The boy had been in the world 1 week longer than his mother. And then, Vivian was told, he too was gone. A complication, a second tragedy. She had not even been allowed to hold him at the end. The family had handled it, they said, to spare her. She had buried a coffin so small, it did not seem possible it could contain a life. And she had gone home to a house that had 2 empty rooms now instead of 1. And she had locked the door of the blue room, Maya's childhood room, the one with clouds painted on the ceiling. And she had not opened it in 14 years. That was the woman who looked at a starving boy's face and felt something move that she could not name. She told herself none of this at dinner. She only asked him his name and where he had grown up. And he told her the truth because she was the first person in a long time who seemed to actually want it. He'd grown up in a children's home, he said, St. Rose's, a place a long way from the city. They'd told him he'd been abandoned as a baby, left with no papers and no name, that nobody had wanted him. That was why, he said, he didn't matter. Not even his own mother had wanted him. Vivian went white. The boy asked if she was all right, offered to get her water, and she waved him off and told him to keep eating, that his story had simply touched her heart, and she was not lying. But she was not telling the whole truth either, because the whole truth was still forming, and it was too enormous to say out loud. She heard herself, some time later, making an offer that startled her as much as it startled him. She lived alone, she said, in a house too big for one person, with rooms closed up and gathering dust. She was tired of the loneliness. Would he come home with her? Just for one night? A warm bed, a shower, clean clothes, and in the morning, if he wanted to go, he could go. And she would not stop him. He thought she was insane. He said so, gently. She didn't know him. He could be a thief. You don't invite a stranger who just asked for your scraps into your home. You're right, she said. It's madness. My lawyers would lose their minds. But there's something about you, boy. Something I can't explain that tells me you didn't come to my table by accident. Call me a sentimental old woman. But I trust you. And it's been a very long time since I trusted anyone. He went with her. He would not be able to explain that decision either. For the rest of his life, why, who trusted no one, who had learned that every open hand eventually became a fist, followed this woman to a car worth more than every building he'd ever slept behind. Maybe it was the food still warm in him. Maybe it was the way she'd said my guest. Maybe some part of him, too, recognized something it had been told to forget. The house rose out of the dark like a hotel with no guests. He stood in the entrance hall and turned in a slow circle and said it was bigger than the whole orphanage. Bigger than 3 orphanages. Too big, he said. A house like this, with no one to fill it with noise, wasn't a home. It was a museum, an elegant mausoleum. He did not know he was describing the exact shape of Vivian's grief. She only nodded and told the housekeeper to prepare a room and draw a hot bath. And then she stood a moment too long deciding which room, and chose one down the hall from the blue door she never opened. That night, while the boys slept under a roof for the first time in 8 months, Vivian sat awake in her study, and she did something she had not done in 14 years. She let herself wonder. It was a dangerous thing to do. Hope, at her age, in her circumstances, was a blade you could cut yourself on. But she had heard him say St. Roses. She had heard him say no papers, no name, left as a baby. And she had done the arithmetic that the boy had done in reverse. And the numbers had lined up in a way that made her hands shake. She told herself it was nothing. Thousands of children pass through such places. A face is not evidence. A feeling is not proof. She went to bed, and she did not sleep. And in the morning, she watched him eat breakfast like a boy who expected the food to be taken away. And she decided she would not say a word to him, not one word, until she was certain. Because if she was wrong, and she raised him up on a hope like that only to let him fall, it would not just break his heart. It would confirm, forever, the thing he already believed about himself, that he was someone the world lifted up only to drop. So she began, quietly, to find out. It would have been simpler if Vivian had been the only one paying attention. She was not. Marcus Ashford was the son of Vivian's late brother, and he had spent his entire adult life administering a fortune he did not own, and had never stopped feeling he deserved. He was 47, precise, unfailingly polite, and he managed the Ashford estate with the quiet resentment of a man who had always been the second name on every door. When Maya was alive, Marcus had watched the fortune's rightful path run straight through her, and then through her son, and he had felt the future being pulled out of his hands by a woman who painted and a child who could not yet spell his own name. He had not killed anyone. Marcus wanted that understood in the private courtroom he kept in his own head, where he was always the reasonable one. When Maya died and the infant was sick and everything was chaos and grief, Marcus had simply seen an opening and taken it. He had paid a social worker named Denise Croft a sum of money that changed her life, and he had asked her to make the child disappear, not to harm him, only to lose him, to process him into the system under a false name so far away that no thread would ever lead back. He had told himself the boy was better off, that the Ashford name was a curse for a child of that bloodline, that Maya had chosen a life of nothing, and this was simply that life continuing. He had arranged the small coffin. He had comforted his aunt at the second funeral. And then he had gone on managing the fortune and had almost, in 14 years, come to believe his own version. So when his aunt's staff mentioned, in the ordinary course of things, that Mrs. Ashford had brought home a homeless boy of about 18 and given him the room down the hall, Marcus felt the floor of his careful world tilt. He drove out to the house. He met the boy. He looked at the boy's face, and the color drained from his own, because Marcus had seen that face before, small and feverish, 14 years ago. He said nothing. He smiled and shook the boy's hand and called him welcome and drove home and poured himself a drink his hand was not steady enough to hold. And then he began, quietly, to make plans of his own. 2 people now, moving in the dark, one trying to recover a truth, one trying to bury it a second time. And between them, a boy who knew nothing except that for the first time in his life, he had a warm bed and a woman who looked at him as though he were worth looking at. The days that followed were, for Eli, the strangest of his life. Nobody took the food away. That was the thing he kept waiting for, and it kept not happening. There was breakfast, and then there was lunch, and then there was dinner, and clean clothes that fit, and a bed that stayed his. He kept his shoes by the door, laced, ready, because 8 months on the street teaches your body to be prepared to run, and it took him longer than he wanted to admit before he stopped sleeping in his clothes. He tried once to leave. 3 days in, unable to bear the weight of a kindness he was certain he would have to repay in a currency he didn't have, he packed the little he owned and made for the door, because it is easier to leave than to be left. Vivian found him in the hall. She didn't argue. She only asked him to stay one more night and then one more after that. And somewhere in the accumulation of one more nights, the shoes by the door came unlaced. He carried the book everywhere. Vivian noticed it the first day and said nothing. It was a child's picture book, handmade, the pages illustrated by hand, in colors that had faded but not surrendered. Clouds mostly, and a small figure beneath them, and words in a careful looping script. He guarded it the way he guarded nothing else. When the housekeeper offered to have it repaired, he nearly took her head off, then apologized for an hour. It was the only thing, he told Vivian once, that had followed him through every placement, every home, every bad night. He didn't know where it came from. It had just always been his. Someone at the very first home had said it came in with him, the one thing that arrived when he did. Vivian asked, as lightly as she could manage, if she might see it sometime. He said maybe. He wasn't ready. She did not push. The care between them grew the way real things grow, slowly, through repetition, through the accumulation of small, unremarkable moments that only later reveal their weight. She taught him which fork. He taught her a card game he'd learned in a shelter. She caught herself laughing and was startled by the sound. It had been a long time. He caught himself relaxing and was frightened by it, because he had learned that the moments you let your guard down are the moments the ground opens. But the ground did not open. Day after day, it simply held. And then, on an ordinary evening, the boy hummed a song, and the world stopped. He wasn't even aware he was doing it. He was setting the table. He'd insisted on helping, could not abide being waited on, and the melody just came out of him, tuneless and half-remembered, the way songs do when the body remembers what the mind has lost. A lullaby, 6 notes, a rise, a fall, a rise. Vivian dropped the glass she was holding. She knew that song. She had not heard it in decades, and she knew it in her bones because she had made it up, invented it, humming over a crib for a daughter who could not yet talk. She had sung it to Maya every night for years. It was not a song that existed anywhere in the world, except in her own memory and in whatever she had passed down. It was not on any record. It could not be learned from anyone but the woman who wrote it, or the child she sang it to. And this boy, this stranger from the street, was humming it while he folded a napkin. She said nothing. It cost her everything. But she said nothing, because she was standing at the edge of a hope so vast that if it turned out to be false, it would kill her. And she would not let herself fall until she was sure. She excused herself. She went to her study and she wept, silently, with her hand over her mouth. Then she wiped her face and she picked up the phone and she called the one investigator she trusted. And she said, "I need you to find everything, every record. And I need you to find a social worker." She would have been young 14 years ago, working the system in the county where St. Rose's operates. Find her, dead or alive. Pay whatever it takes. The boy, meanwhile, had noticed the change in her and drawn exactly the wrong conclusion. She had gone cold, he thought. Distant. He knew that cooling. He had felt it in a dozen foster homes. The slow retreat that came right before they sent you back. He began, without meaning to pull away first. He stopped unlacing his shoes. But Eli did something in those days he had never done before. He got curious. The old woman's grief had a shape to it, a specificity, and he was too smart and too watchful not to notice. She looked at him too long. She flinched at things, a song, a phrase, the tilt of his head. Once he'd found a door on the 2nd floor that was always locked, and once he'd caught her standing in front of it with her hand flat against the wood and an expression he had no name for. He started asking questions, careful ones. He asked the housekeeper how long the blue room had been closed. He asked why a woman with all this had no family in it. He got no answers, but he learned that there were answers, and that they were being kept from him. And a boy who has spent his life being told half-truths develops a sharp instinct for the shape of the thing that isn't being said. The investigation moved faster than the manipulation, but only just. Within a week, the investigator had found a thread. 14 years ago, in the county where St. Rose's operated, a child had been processed into the system with no name and no papers, logged by a caseworker named Denise Croft. The timing was right. The age was right. The absence of documentation was not an accident of poverty. It had the fingerprints of something deliberate, and the burial that Vivian had attended, the small coffin she had followed to the ground, began to look, in the cold light of a case file, like something that had been staged. Denise Croft was alive, barely. She was dying of cancer in a small house 200 miles from the city, and she had weeks, the investigator said, maybe days. And when he had spoken her name and Vivian's in the same breath, the woman had broken down and wept, and said she had been waiting 14 years for someone to come and ask her this question. She did not want to die with it on her. Vivian drove the 200 miles herself. She would not send anyone, and she sat at the bedside of the woman who had helped erase her grandson, and she listened to a confession that rearranged the entire architecture of her grief. The fever had been real, Denise said, but the baby had lived. The baby had recovered, and someone had paid her an enormous sum, more than she'd make in a decade, to make the child vanish, to register him as an abandoned infant. No name, no papers, in a home far enough away that no one would ever connect him to the family he'd been stolen from. They wanted me to do worse, Denise said. They wanted him gone for good. I couldn't, God help me. I took the money, but I couldn't do that. He was such a beautiful, healthy little boy. So I left him at St. Rose's, and I prayed every day for 20 years that he'd have a chance at a life. I kept the paperwork, all of it, and I kept the recording of the man giving me the order because I was afraid of him, and it was the only insurance I had. She reached for a box beside the bed. Use it. Bury him with it. It's the only good thing I have left to do. Who? Vivian's voice was barely her own. Who paid you? And Denise told her. The order had come from inside the family, from her late husband's side, from her nephew, from Marcus. Vivian sat very still for a long time. 14 years of grief reorganized itself in that quiet room into something with a name and an address. Her nephew. For the inheritance. He had taken a living child from a grieving grandmother and put a coffin in the ground and comforted her at the funeral, all for money. She did not scream. Women like Vivian, who have survived by control, do not scream. She thanked Denise. She took the box, and she began to plan, with a cold precision that had built an empire, how to give her grandson back his name and his family, and how to take everything from the man who had stolen them. But she still could not tell the boy. Not yet. She had a confession and a recording and a paper trail, and it was almost enough. But almost was the most dangerous word in the language, when a child's heart was the thing at stake. She needed it to be certain. She needed it to be a wall he could lean his whole weight against without it moving. So she held the truth in her chest like a coal. And she came home, and the boy saw that she had been crying, and asked if he'd done something wrong. And she said, "No, my boy, you could never." And he did not believe her, because no one had ever told him that, and meant it. Marcus, sensing the tightening around him, changed his strategy. He could not simply make the boy disappear again. The boy was inside the house now, watched, cared for, and any harm would point straight at him. So Marcus reached for a subtler weapon, one that required no violence at all. Violence left traces. What he needed was doubt. He needed Vivian herself to throw the boy out, because a grandmother who has just been handed back a grandchild she buried is not strong. She is fragile in a very particular way. She is terrified it isn't real. She has spent 14 years learning not to hope. And hope, when it finally comes, arrives braided together with a bone-deep fear that it will be snatched away. All Marcus had to do was feed that fear. He didn't need to prove the boy was a fraud. He only needed to make it possible and let Vivian's own terror do the rest. He was helped, unknowingly, by a man from the boy's past, because Eli had not always been alone. In the months after aging out, there had been someone, a smooth, older man named Ray, who had run a small crew of kids working the streets, who had taken Eli in, and then, when the boy proved too honest to be useful, thrown him out onto exactly the avenue where Vivian would find him. Ray had heard the way people like Ray always hear, that one of his old kids had landed soft, had somehow ended up in a mansion, at a billionaire's table, and Ray had gone looking for a way to turn that into money, which was how Ray ended up in a quiet meeting with a precise, polite man named Marcus, who had a great deal of money and a shared interest in making one particular boy disappear from one particular old woman's life. "You're the one who put him on the street," Marcus said, when he understood who Ray was. "In a way, all of this is your doing. If you hadn't thrown him out, he'd never have ended up at that restaurant, and my aunt would never have found him. I almost owe you." Ray smiled. "And that's exactly why I can fix it. I know him. I know his fear. I know how to make him look like a con man, because I taught him half of what a con man knows. We don't need to touch him. We need her to believe the boy planned it, that he knew who he was from the start, that the whole thing, the hunger, the leftovers, the tears, was an act to worm his way into her heart and her money." Marcus began to like Ray very much. What followed came in pieces, each one small enough to seem plausible. A letter arrived, unsigned, suggesting the boy was not what he seemed. Then a photograph, subtly staged, that seemed to show Eli meeting with a stranger. Then a witness, a man Ray had paid, who swore with tears in his eyes that he had overheard the boy and an older man laughing about the rich old woman who was about to fall right into their trap. Each piece alone was nothing. Together, dripped into the ear of a woman, already trembling at the edge of a hope too large to hold, they began to work. And they worked precisely because they landed on the oldest wound Vivian had. She had spent her life being betrayed by people who wanted her money. She had built walls against exactly this. And some cold, self-protecting voice in the back of her mind, the same voice that had once told her Maya was throwing her life away, began to whisper, "What if the song was learned somehow? What if the boy knew all along? What if you were being played, you foolish old woman, by the very grief that makes you weak?" For 2 days she went cold. The boy felt it and knew exactly what it was. And then, on the 3rd day, she broke. She confronted him. She meant to be careful, and she was not. Because fear is not careful. She asked him about a man in a photograph. She asked if he'd known who she was before he ever asked for her leftovers. She asked if this had all been a performance. The boy went very quiet. And then something in his face closed like a door. And Eli saw, in the old woman's eyes, the exact expression he had spent his whole life running from. The look of someone deciding you were a thing to be discarded. "You think I tricked you?" he said. His voice didn't shake. That was the worst part. It didn't shake. "You think the hunger was an act. You think I cried in that restaurant on purpose. You think I've been sleeping under your roof, planning to rob you." He stood. He went to get his bag, the old instinct rising, faster and surer than any other instinct he had. "For a few days, I let myself believe someone actually wanted me. That was stupid. I know better." He put the book in the bag, gently, the only gentle motion in the room. "Keep your money. I never wanted your money. I just wanted somebody. And that's the one thing you people never actually give." He walked to the door, and Vivian, watching him go, felt the whisper in her mind fall suddenly silent, because a con man, a boy who wanted her fortune, does not walk away from it. A boy after her money would have wept and begged and fought to stay. Only a boy who wanted a family and had just been told again that he didn't deserve one would leave with his chin up and his heart in pieces. Only her daughter's son, only a real grandson would give up millions rather than beg for a love he'd been told was fake. "Stop," she said. "Stop, Eli, please." He stopped, but he didn't turn. "Forgive me," she said, and the empire was gone from her voice. There was only an old woman in it now. "Forgive me for doubting you. For one moment I let fear blind me. I have spent 22 years being betrayed by people who wanted what I have, and it taught me to distrust everything. And I almost let that garbage steal the only pure thing left in my life. But I looked at you walk toward that door, and I knew. No liar gives up a fortune for a hug. Only a real boy does that. Only mine." He turned then. "Yours," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Sit down," she said. "There's something I should have told you days ago, and I'm going to tell you all of it. But first, I need you to know that whatever you decide after, whether you stay or you go, you are not, and you have never been, someone nobody wanted. There was a whole family that wanted you. There was a mother who loved you, and a grandmother who mourned you. The world lied to you, my boy, in the cruelest way there is. And I am going to spend whatever I have left proving it." She told him everything. She told him about Maya, his mother, the artist, the one who painted clouds and loved a gentle man and made a handmade book for her son. She told him about the fever and the funeral and the small coffin she had followed into the ground. She told him about St. Rose's and the false name and the woman named Denise who had taken money to make him disappear but couldn't bring herself to do work. And she told him who had paid her. The boy listened without moving. And when she was done, he did not say, "This doesn't happen in real life," the way another boy might. He reached into his bag and he took out the book, and for the first time he opened it and turned it toward her. To the last page, where beneath a painting of clouds there was a lullaby written in a careful, looping hand. 6 lines of a song no one in the world knew but the woman who had invented it. Vivian read the first line and could not read the second, because she was weeping. She had written that melody. Her daughter had written down the word, and the child of them both had carried it, unknowing, through 14 years of homes that were not homes, humming it to himself in the dark because it was the one warm thing that had ever belonged to him. "That's my mother's handwriting," Eli said quietly. "Isn't it? That is your mother's handwriting," Vivian said. "And that is my song. I made it up over her crib before she could talk. She made you this book. You've been carrying your mother this whole time, and you didn't even know." He put his hand flat over the page, the way, unknowing, he had once seen her stand before a locked door. There would be a DNA test. Vivian insisted on it. Not because she doubted, she no longer doubted anything, but because when she brought Marcus down, she wanted a wall no lawyer could climb over, and a feeling is not a wall. She arranged it properly, a real lab, a real sample, real consent from a boy old enough to give it, 48 hours. But she knew what it would say before it said it, and so did he. And in those 48 hours, something happened that no test could have produced. A grandmother and a grandson, in a house that had been a mausoleum, began, carefully, disbelievingly, to become a family. He told her the rest of his story, the part he'd been too ashamed to tell before, about the winters at St. Rose's with no heat, about the scholarship he'd won and how proud he'd been, about a man named Ray who'd found him after he aged out, who'd made him feel useful for the first time, and then thrown him away when he wouldn't steal. That was how he'd ended up on the avenue. That was the man in the photograph. Not a partner in a con, but the last person who'd discarded him. "Ray," Vivian repeated, and something cold and clear settled over her face. "The man feeding lies to me is the same man who threw you onto my doorstep." The pieces locked together. Marcus and Ray, the nephew who stole him and the man who lost him, working together to lose him again. The results came back. 99.9%. But Vivian was already at the door of the blue room by then, the room she had not opened in 14 years, turning a key she'd carried without ever using. Inside were clouds painted on the ceiling by a man with a guitar weeks before his son was born. It had been Maya's room, and it had been meant to be Eli's, and it had waited 14 years in the dark. She opened it, and she brought her grandson inside, and she showed him the clouds his father had painted, and neither of them could speak. Now it was time to give Marcus what he was owed. Vivian was thorough. She gathered Denise's signed confession, sworn before a notary. She had the recording. Marcus's own voice, 14 years younger, giving the order. She had the paper trail of the false registration. She had the book and the song and the DNA. And she made one final arrangement, because she wanted Marcus to hang himself in public, in the place where it had all begun. She invited him to the restaurant. She told him she'd caught a street thief pretending to be her grandson, trying to steal the family fortune, and that he should come see for him. Marcus, who believed his campaign of doubt had worked, who believed the old woman was finally throwing the boy out, came gladly. He brought Ray. He even encouraged the paid witness to be nearby. He walked into Vivian's restaurant, to Vivian's corner table, expecting a victory. He found his aunt and the boy, and a table set for more people than he'd expected. "Oh, how terrible all this has been," Marcus said, arranging his face into concern. "I warned you that boy was suspicious. A street orphan. What could you expect? You've done the right thing calling me. Family has to protect itself from predators." "You know so much about protecting family, Marcus," Vivian said. "Tell me, what really happened to my grandson 14 years ago?" A flicker. "He recovered. He died, Aunt Vivian. A tragedy. You know that. You were there." "How strange," she said. "Because I have a recording here of you giving a nurse the order to make him disappear. And I have the nurse, alive, with a signed confession. And I have the man beside you, Ray, who took your money to slander my grandson. My grandson Marcus, the child you buried for an inheritance, is alive, and he knows everything. And there are police in the street outside. I wouldn't run." The color went out of Marcus's face. Ray was already looking for the exit, and Marcus, cornered, did the last thing he had left to do. He turned to the boy, and he reached for the only weapon he had ever truly trusted. "How much?" he said quietly, so the others might not hear. "Whatever she's giving you, I'll match it. I'll double it. You take it and you disappear, back to whatever gutter she found you in, and everyone's better off. That's all you are, boy. That's all you'll ever be. A price. So name it." And this was the moment the whole story had been walking toward. Not the recording, not the DNA. This. A boy who had been told his entire life that he was worth nothing, being offered at last a great deal of money to agree. Eli stood. He looked at the man who had stolen 14 years of his life, and he did not shout. "You're right about one thing," he said, and the room went still. "I grew up on the street. I was hungry. I asked strangers for their leftovers. And you know what I learned out there?" He glanced at Vivian, then back at Marcus. "I learned that money doesn't make a person. The heart does. You have everything you stole, and you're still the poorest man in this room. I slept in a doorway with a picture book, and I was richer than you'll ever be, because at least the book loved me back." He shook his head slowly. "Keep your money, Uncle. I already found the only thing I ever wanted, and you can't buy it and you can't steal it, because you tried, and here it is anyway." The police came through the door. Marcus Ashford was arrested for the kidnapping of a minor, for fraud, for false testimony, for the theft and concealment of a child. Ray was taken with him. The paid witness, faced with the recording and the confession, folded immediately and admitted to perjury, and named the men who'd paid him. "That boy will never be in Ashford." Marcus spat as they took him. "He's a nobody from the street." Eli didn't rise to it. He'd heard worse from better. "You keep saying that," he said, "like it's the insult you think it is. I was a nobody from the street, and I still wouldn't trade places with you. The cost of it all could not simply be erased And the story did not pretend otherwise. 14 years were gone. A boy had grown up cold and hungry and alone, while a woman 200 miles away slept in a house with his room waiting empty down the hall, and no verdict could give those years back. Maya was still dead. The gentle man who painted clouds was still gone. Vivian would carry, alongside her joy, the knowledge of every winter her grandson had spent without her. And Eli would carry, alongside his, the long habit of expecting to be left. But some things were repaired. Denise Croft received, before she died a few weeks later, a visit from the woman she had wronged and the boy she had saved. Vivian forgave her, truly from the heart, because Denise had taken the money, but had not been able to do the worst thing, and in refusing it, she had left a door open that 14 years had finally walked back through. You could have ended his life, Vivian told her. You didn't. And because of that, I have him now. Rest. You did the one good thing in the end. It was enough. Eli went back to school. He didn't have to. The whole Ashford fortune was his now. Legally, undeniably. But he wanted to be a teacher, the way his mother had dreamed of teaching, the way he dreamed of it in a cold library at St. Rose's, reading falling-apart books 3 times each because there was nothing else warm to do. He wanted to earn his own place in the world. That's my grandson, Vivian said when he told her. And the pride in it was so total it frightened them both. And the blue room did not stay a shrine. They opened the window. They kept the clouds on the ceiling because a father had painted them. But they filled the room with a living boy's thing. And the door that had been locked for 14 years stood open now, always letting the light move through. On the last night this story will tell you about, they went back to the restaurant, to the same corner table where a starving boy had once asked a lonely woman for her scrap. But the table was set for 2 now, and it had been for a while, and neither of them ate alone anymore. Somewhere between the fish and the chocolate dessert, without either of them planning it, the boy to hum 6 notes, a rhyme, and this time his grandmother's voice came in beneath his, low and unsteady and sure, singing the words her daughter had written down in a house that had finally stopped being a museum. Greed had once put a small coffin in the ground and called it a grandson. But worth is not measured in what a person owns, or in what a nephew can steal, or in what a stranger will pay to make you disappear. It is measured in what you carry through the dark when you have nothing else, and in what you choose when someone finally offers you a prize. The boy had carried a song and a book and refused a fortune, and the life that greed had tried to bury had come back to the same table, in the same light, to sing.